Things are starting to move around in the markets. And of course, some of the things that we're seeing is how people are looking at international opportunities around whether you're a Bitcoiner or maybe you're just into cryptocurrency as a whole. Well, today we're going to be breaking down a little bit more about all that. I think you guys are going to love it. My name is Paul Barron. Welcome back into Tech Path. Before we get started with our guest today, I want to thank our sponsor, and that is Coinbase. If you're looking at getting into crypto maybe for the first time, this is maybe your first time to go out and purchase a token, make sure and do it on a trusted exchange. You can do that, of course, over on Coinbase. Future money is here, most trusted place for people to and businesses to buy, sell, and use crypto. So check it out. You'll get a $200 crypto reward by just signing up. So check it out. Use our link down below. It'll get you started. All right, so let's get into it. I want to go a little bit further into this. This is something that we've talked about for quite some time around getting into a topic of how people are starting to see crypto as more of a global impact on whether it's wealth growth or you're just in a position to maybe, hey, I want to look at retirement. All those kind of things really start to play out into a strategy. And we're going to have Nomad Capitalist on today, who is Andrew Henderson. You guys have probably seen him. Andrew, good to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Andrew, let's get into a little bit about Nomad Capitalist. Some people may not know your channel. Of course, you guys just search Nomad Capitalist. You'll find it over there on YouTube. You guys talk a lot about going where you're treated best. Is that the claim to fame? Give us a little bit
That's
of a
the
rundown
five
of what you
magic
guys.
words. Go,
Yeah.
yeah, go where you're treated best. And
Yeah.
I think that I've looked for years since I was a kid around the dinner table with my family at the statistics and the indexes and the benchmarks, and I see where I'm from in the United States and other Western countries, what we call the legacy brand countries that are kind of living off of fumes. They were once worth going to, but now it's kind of just the residual marketing. It takes decades to get marketing out of people's brains.
Yeah.
And so I've been watching for decades how these countries are heading in the wrong direction. And the people in those countries often laugh at the countries that are growing that you don't hear a lot about in the Western media. The countries where I'm in, places like Malaysia, where we host our annual event and I spend my winters. It's tax friendly. The quality of living is great. The people are a lot nicer. I mean, there's a lot of things in a country like Malaysia and many other emerging countries that are growing. And now I think you're seeing this multipolarity where different businesses are not welcome in different parts of the world. Different investors are not welcome. Crypto investors, if you're an American, you're at a disadvantage. And so you're kind of seeing a reduction in freedom on the personal freedom, freedom economically in Western countries. And you're seeing in some places overseas an increase. And so what I've said is go where you're treated best. It doesn't have to be the same place. You could put your brokerage account somewhere, your bank account somewhere else. You could put your crypto account somewhere else. If you're holding it on an exchange, as you mentioned, you could live somewhere else. You can have your business somewhere else entirely. Figure out what is the best place for each part of your life. You can marry someone or date someone from somewhere else. People come up to me. I'm at the love of my life following your advice. So, go where you're treated best, and it doesn't have to be just one place.
Yeah. I think the key here is we've seen, most of our audience, about 45% or so, are US based. And then we have another 160 countries that follow this channel around the world, obviously crypto centric. That really has kind of set up, I think, into a very unique position because of what we've seen with MiCA. We'll talk about that in the EU, but also we're starting to see the Pacific Rim become a lot more receptive of what's been happening in Web3, crypto, and of course, blockchain technologies going forward. With that being the case, and if the U.S. does lose its pole position in terms of kind of the next generation of technology, many people would look at Silicon Valley as kind of the reason that the U.S. rose to power, and I would agree with that. But if you look at the next generation, whether that's AI, obviously chips, as well as the software that might be offshoring, and then of course blockchain going offshore, when you look at that and you see the different areas and regions of the globe, what have you seen that has been more technologically savvy that could fit into at least the blockchain side of things? Is it mostly in the Pacific Rim, or are you seeing things like in Dubai, et cetera?
Well, it's all over. I mean, for years now, the country of Georgia, which I talked about a long time ago, I mean, they decided to put a lot of their public records on the blockchain, and so they've embraced technologies. I think what you're seeing, there's a couple trends. smaller countries in a more competitive world want to gain an edge. And so if you're into crypto or Web3 or AI, there may be a country that's specifically of interest to you that might not be of interest as much to someone who runs a consulting business, for example, because what you're going to see is, and imagine this, countries competing for your business. There are a number of countries that have tax incentives, hiring incentives, grants, from Chile, a dozen years ago to Armenia today, and many others to bring your tech company there. They've got special regimes for tech companies. They want those people to come. I can't bring my business, a consulting business, there and reduce my taxes to single digits, but a tech business could. And so, it's kind of like, the dollar is the world reserve currency. People say, oh, it's never going to fall off its pedestal. What would replace it? Well, that's exactly the point. Nothing is going to replace it. It's just going to slowly lose share as, the yen added 2 percentage points in the last couple of years, the euro, everybody's adding a couple of percentage points. And I think that's what countries are looking at in a space like this. Hey, if we could add a niche field in Bermuda or Malta or Georgia, catered to crypto and Bitcoin miners with cheap electricity, for example. If we can just get this one field and be known for that, that's all we need. I just interviewed a guy, he renounced U.S. citizenship like 30 years ago. He moved to Anguilla in the Caribbean. They got 14,000 people. And he says by the end of this year, half of the entire island's budget is going to come from .ai domains. I mean, if you got $6 million a month in the United States, that would pay the debt off for about a millisecond. But it pays off, it pays half the expenses of this island. And so you can do things a lot more innovative. And so I think when you look at, the US, and I think, people can say Trump's going to be a good thing, but I think Trump's going to, ratchet up some of the, he talks about trade wars and stuff with China. You see companies like Kaspersky Labs now recently, wanting to they have to get out of the US. They're Russian. You see Chinese companies getting out. What's happening? More, quote unquote, enemy countries for Westerners are developing their own stuff. They're going to make their own chips. They're going to do their own thing. And I think that's just going to keep contributing to multipolarity, more competition around the world that never existed 25 years ago when I was a kid. There weren't that many options, and now there are. I think you're looking for smaller countries that are pro-free market, and that want to attract this particular niche.
Well, I think, when you look at Trump's position, obviously we've seen, so pretty big deals happening here over the last couple of weeks with Trump also pivoting his position on blockchain, because he's been one that was somewhat anti-blockchain. And I think once Vivek Ramaswamy was able to kind of get in his ear, teach him a little bit of what is happening.
I think he said it was a scam in 2019.
He did, very, very anti-crypto. And education sometimes, I think, will open, true innovators' minds. Now, whether Trump is a true innovator or not, the fact is he sees there's an opportunity here for the United States to maybe get a pole position in technology again. Now, is it too late is the real question. What we've seen happening not only in Japan, and I'll talk about that in a second, also in Hong Kong. Then you look at Singapore as being a hub now for a lot of blockchain development companies, including Cambodia. And then you look at Dubai, which is kind of the haven for millionaires that have kind of already made it and are looking to kind of grow their consulting business. Do you think that Trump could come in, get in a position, even if he does do a hard line in terms of import-export, but at least get back into putting the U.S. in an innovation stance in terms of growth? Do you think that is a possibility?
By the way, I think that the consulting business owner should look at other options than Dubai. I mean, we've got about 32 tax-friendly countries. Dubai now has, and the UAE now has, a 9% tax for almost all businesses. So if you're choosing somewhere to move, and there's a place that's 0, 1, 2, or 5% that maybe you can get a passport from while you're living there, that should be considered. I mean, don't just look at, hey, I'm paying 40 now, I can go to 9. That's pretty good. Well, if you could go from 40 to 3, plus you get a passport 5 years from now and you get that extra perk, that's worth considering. But to your point on Trump, I'm an entrepreneur first and an investor second. I think just that's how I'm wired. And so I've said, for example, I'm not going to buy NVIDIA stock. I do have, a tech, fund, a tech ETF, and NVIDIA's in there. But I spend my time running my business. That's my growth stock. And for me to pay attention to all the machinations of what's happening in AI, and is there someone who's going to overtake NVIDIA, and always paying attention to that. If you're a full-time investor, that's one thing. But for the rest of us, I just can't do that. And I look at countries the same way. Trump gets in for 4 years. Does that mean that the culture of the United States has changed? I don't think it does. I think it means that people flip like the wind. I think it means that people in the US and other Western countries are harder hit than ever. I just saw it takes you to the middle of July living in London just to pay your rent. So people are hurting. And this is what I talked about
Yeah.
with my father when I was 12, 13, 14 years old. I don't think people have changed the culture of give us free stuff, regulate the rich guys, take from them. I think that's generally where the Western world is going increasingly. And I see that. I think that people, number one, Joe Biden, probably the worst political candidate, in the history of planet Earth or planet Zutron. So there's that. And I think people are just saying, let's shake things up. I don't think that's an endorsement from the average person for
Yeah.
crypto or Web3 or AI. And if some other demagogue comes in and says, hey, these people, look at these crypto bros, look at them in Dubai. They're with the Ukrainian girls with their US passport. They're not paying us everything. You think the average American or Brit or Australian's not going to say, yeah, that's offensive. I'm paying, I can barely pay my rent. Yeah, go after that guy. I think citizenship-based taxation in the U.S. is already a thing. I think more Western countries will bring it in. So sure, maybe it gets better for 4 years. But I'll tell you, we have a company in another Western country, Ireland. We have some staff there, and I saw the tax return they had to file for that company and the work they had to do to manage that company. It is night and day difference than the U.S., where you're pooping your pants practically, worrying that you don't put the wrong number in the wrong place by accident and they come and get you. It's only the United States where I see, like, I go on CoinDesk, and every day someone's being sued by the U.S. or someone's being thrown in prison. I'm sure some of them deserve it, and I'm sure some of them were just like running an honest business like entrepreneurs do. And I just don't know that one guy gets in power. I mean, I think with anything, you've got to, the United States is not a country that turns on a dime. It's an aircraft carrier, not a pontoon boat. And I don't know how one guy in 4 years changes the fabric of the country.
Well, I think the key here is understanding where innovation can happen, because really entrepreneurs are looking for places to do startups. You look at a lot of companies now who are stateside here in the US, including companies like our own and a media company, who have looked at blockchain integrations in a lot of varieties of our own businesses. And we start to question whether or not it's even going to be innovative enough here in the US. So if you look at that as a challenge, because in the past, the United States has been pretty much the crib, the cradle of innovation, especially around technology, where would you say is the next, I won't say Silicon Valley, but at least the next innovation hub or mecca that is starting to emerge early on? Because right now it feels like there's a lot of jockeying for position right now around the world.
Well, this is kind of the classic question, is how much development and how much infrastructure do you want? So you mentioned Singapore, more recently Dubai. I was talking to a very wealthy guy in Dubai not that long ago. He said back in the mid 2010s, nobody was here. This was like a real nascent place for tech and for innovation, and now it's a hub. Now again, I mean, you saw in the UAE, I mean, they changed the free zone after saying they wouldn't, and now there is a tax. Okay, I'm not opposed to paying any tax at all. I just think people should be aware there is a tax there for most companies now. So those are maybe two that have more development. Now you could argue, someone that changes their tax policy in a dime is less developed, but as Singapore is there, Malta is a developed place, and I think that they're trying to get into some of these spaces. Again, Georgia in some regard Bermuda was in there. I mean, I think there's a lot of places. I mean, you're seeing just even parts of places that are interested in doing this. I mean, there's guys down, in El Salvador, of course, who are interested, and the president there. Is Argentina going to be a place? I'm not so convinced. But, the question is, do I want to go to the place where it's already working, or do I want to go somewhere up and coming? I mean, I mentioned even Armenia. A little bit more developed than that is Israel. I mean, they have tech spaces. So, it's, what am I comfortable going to? For me, I like to live in places that have some room to run, but not everybody's going to agree with me. Somebody might want to go to Singapore. Now, the challenge that I see from the Nomad Capitalist perspective is that Singapore is a hard place to get into these days. You better start one hell of a business that impresses them. And even then, there's going to be some restrictions on you moving there and your family moving there for a little while. You're not going to get citizenship the way you used to be able to. So you're always going to kind of be there in a residence permit. It's not the lowest tax jurisdiction. So, you always want to look at what's the reality on the ground if you want to go there. The place that's super developed may say, well, we only need you if you've got, $50 million in revenue. And so if you're not there, it may be harder to move in.
So, okay, so that brings up a point, and I think this is something that has started to make its way into Western countries more so. Ramaswamy talks a little bit about this. Border problems are not just in the United States, but that's one of our biggest one. You get the law and order issue that has started to appear in a lot of the EU. You also have economy issues that are in some of these emerging markets. Where would you go? And if you are a business owner, if you're an innovator, if you're a software developer, you're someone in Web3 that's starting to build a new business. Yeah. I'm looking at the landscape and I'm saying, Andrew, there doesn't seem to be a lot of places to really hang our hat.
Well, there's 252 sovereign countries and autonomous territories out there. I think that what you want to do is two things. Number one, you can't look at the places that you've heard of. And so, people will say, oh, I'm from the US. Well, Canada was the option 20 years ago. Now look at it. And the UK is not great. And I took a vacation to Italy and they're having problems. Well, number one, from a tax perspective, Italy has gotten so bad that they've realized, hey, let's have a number of different tax incentives for both average people and rich people. And so you can go there and pay a pretty low rate of tax, at least for quite a number of years. But if that's your system, right? How many people are thinking about Georgia? El Salvador's gotten some press now in the Bitcoin community, but how many people are thinking about Malaysia, for example? Yeah. Someone the other day, I made a video and I said, the average American probably thinks Malaysia's a hellhole. And someone said, that's dumb. And someone else replied, I bet 75% of Americans think it's like collapsing and people are dying in the streets. So, if you're only looking at the places that are similar to yours, you're going to come to that conclusion. I think we just put out something recently saying, if you're worried about the whole, World Economic Forum kind of stuff, where you should really look at least having a passport and having optionality. I'm not saying move there, but I'm saying having optionality for the future, Africa. But, it's easy to laugh at that and say, yeah, but Africa, look at Africa. Okay, well, listen, a lot changes in a decade and certainly in 2 or 3 or 5 decades. In the same way that, if I had to give birth somewhere, if I'm American, I would give birth in Mexico. I would want my child, fine, get him a U.S. passport if you can also, but I would rather my child be Mexican 20 years from now. I think there'll be fewer restrictions, fewer regulations, and more opportunities. And if they can be both, all the better. So that's the first thing you have to consider. The second thing is I would live in a place where I feel good, where I have an affordable and a nice lifestyle, where I'm left alone with what I call soft freedom. So Malaysia would fit into that criteria. People are pretty chill. If you're a foreigner, they leave you alone. They're not really bothered with what you're doing overseas for the most part. And then I'd have my business structured somewhere else. Our business is set up in a place we have 0 people located there. Well, okay, I mean, 0 people kind of like working on the business. And so I think that that's the part that I'm saying. I would find a place where I like to live, where from an economic and a personal freedom standpoint, they're not concerned what I'm doing. Tax systems that say, hey, what you do somewhere else is your business. And just a fabric where it's like, hey, we don't want to screw with people, maybe in general, or certainly not foreigners. And so if you can cut those two in half, Dubai is that one place some people like to live there, and the taxes were always good. So that's kind of one-stop shopping. If you want to do that, that's fine. I don't think that you're that diversified. So I would certainly want other residence permits, passports, places to go, that kind of thing. But, to that point, by the way, the one thing that nails a lot of people in Malaysia is the time zone. If your customers are your people, you're 12, 13 hours ahead of New York. And people, I had a guy from Ireland go there. He's like, man, I'm up till 2 a.m. He's like, everything else is great, but that. So maybe that's what sinks it for you. Okay, what's the equivalent? Maybe it's Uruguay in South America, where they just kind of leave your offshore stuff alone and you set up shop in whatever the best place for you. Maybe it is Dubai. Maybe you're willing to pay the 9% because you like the regulatory framework they're building and you like their attitude because they do want to put themselves on the map. So it could be live in Uruguay, live in Malaysia, have your business in Dubai, have your business, in Malta. But I would look at cutting it up. But there's 252 places to go. There's somewhere to go.
Yeah. Okay, so you look at the changes that are happening in the EU. MiCA has been passed, which is basically a crypto regulation front that is very favorable to a certain extent. I always look at it in the sense of I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, in the EU around the companies that are now kind of flocking to this area. But MiCA, of course, talked about a couple of things. Are going after more consumer protection, more market stability, crypto businesses, getting them licensed. So at least there's a pathway, because we're here in the US, it's almost impossible because the SEC is constantly on top of these guys. But could the EU end up fostering a handful of countries that might be good for this next generation of tech? And specifically, I want to look at places like Portugal, which has been a market. A good friend of mine set up a shop there. He's got a great media company running it. But he himself has said he probably would make a different choice now. What are your thoughts on the EU if we do see some tech advances there?
I mean, Portugal is a good place to live, and they had the tax incentive. They got rid of the tax incentive. Now they may bring it back in a quite limited capacity. So I think that Portugal, the ship has sailed. And again, if you like living there and you're already living there and you already have that 10-year tax deal, great. I don't see a reason to go out of all the places on earth to a place that is affordable. But I mean, the Communist Party gets a chunk of the vote there. And it's been that way since I first went 15 years ago. I think you can find other places. We've got a guy on my team who even advocates that for a limited period of time, you'd be halfway, better off in Spain, which is crazy to me. I mean, listen, I have mixed feelings on the EU. It is very regulated. You can look at it both ways in terms of all the consumer protection laws. Yes, they're always going after tech companies. There's this kind of animosity between the US and the EU, and they look out for their citizens kind of thing. I will say this. I'm in business and I'm generally pro-business. I think there's more of a logic at times to what the EU does and the framework they try to build. I don't always agree with the framework, but it makes a bit more sense to me in terms of what they're trying to accomplish, even if I don't agree with it. So I feel maybe Germany's a little bit different, but many of the EU countries, and I mentioned Ireland is one, it just feels a bit easier to operate, even if things are not quite as agreeable to a tech company. And I think you will see some companies, again, I mean, just looking at this the other day, I mean, the populations of some of these countries in Europe are not that big. Some of them, they want to get on the map. Everyone's competing today. That's the message. It was not the case when I was a kid. Every country is competing now. You've got countries that were left for dead 30 years ago that have thrown their hat in the ring, and they have grown 5-10x faster than Western countries. So yes, I think there's an opportunity. The other benefit is if you're an EU citizen, if an EU member state, you can move around. If you're a US citizen, you can move from California to Texas, but the federal government still rules. I mean, to say you got rid of a state tax, well, that's great, but you still have all the federal rules, all the federal regulations, everything. In the European Union, if you're Irish, you can say, hey, Malta's the best place. I'm just going to move there, and it's a whole new ballgame. And unlike the US, Ireland, or all the other EU countries let you out when you no longer live there. Their regulations and taxes don't follow you. So if I had to choose between being European and American, I think you've got a lot more optionality as a European, even though I don't agree with absolutely everything that they said.
Yeah. I can understand that. You spoke of a lot of these emerging markets. One of the areas we've been watching quite a bit, primarily as a potential for an alternate reserve system out there, and that is BRICS. When you look at the BRICS organization and also just the amount of countries that are starting to roll into this and the potential for them to de-dollarize, because this is something that is really kind of showcasing a little bit. This is Iran who just proposed this, but they're looking at de-dollarization campaign that would change bilateral oil and gas to trade deals. And this could implement potentially looking at things around cryptocurrency, which of course would be very beneficial to our audience. You look at BRICS as a whole, and if it continues to grow in terms of the number of countries that are joining it, within that group, have you analyzed the BRICS group as far as countries and said, okay, well, these might be some potential opportunities here for nomads?
We have looked at it, and again, it's a spectrum of, how much development do you want? I mean, okay,
Mhm.
Uganda is a pretty small player in the world of BRICS. I think there's some interesting things in Uganda. I think that as part of a play, once you get past your plan B, I look at plan E, F, G. We have more clients who are looking at doing very deep, backup planning. That's something for a real adventurer. The stuff like that I've done in Cambodia, in Georgia, in other countries like that, for over a decade has paid off. I'm happy I have it. I think there's value to that in terms of, hey, it's easy to get a passport. It's easy to get a residence permit. It's easy to get cheap deals. It's easy to talk to people in the government and pitch, crypto when no one else is interested. On the other hand, what I mentioned, Malaysia, Thailand, they recently won in. Here's the interesting analogy, vis-a-vis Trump, is America first to the United States. And the reason I always thought that was kind of weird, people say, oh, well, why don't you believe America first? I'm okay with America first, but it should be other countries can have their country first. So Malaysia
Yeah.
first is what they're saying. We want to join BRICS. Why? The same thing that the African countries say, the same thing that all of the countries are saying. The US comes as the only, guy on the block, and they bully us and they lecture us and they tell us, hey, you got to be on our side or else you're bad. And now we have an alternative. 75% of Malaysians would rather be with China. And that sounds scary to Americans. I swear,
Mm.
Malaysians probably the nicest people and the kindest people you'll ever meet. But 75% of them say, you know what? Geopolitically, militarily, all those things, we're better off with China. We've been a US
Interesting.
ally. They haven't done much for us. Africa says the same thing. It's all about we want to grow our economy. We don't want crumbs of aid. We don't want you to lecture us. We want business partnerships. And so those countries are doing what's best for them. And they're saying, let's join BRICS. I think the US flew too close to the sun. They have 5x'd in this century the number of people and basically countries that they've sanctioned. 19% of the world is sanctioned by the US
Yeah.
government now. Really, 19% of every man, woman, and child you see out in the street is a terrible person who deserves to be shut out of the financial system?
Yeah.
No, they got drunk on power. There was no one to rein them in. There was nobody else. And I think that a lot of Americans who think, oh, this is still going to be the best country, they're looking at the marketing campaign from 10 and 20 years ago, not realizing that, Indonesia just went out and dramatically increased their economy at a 7 to 10x faster pace than Germany did this century. You haven't heard about it yet, but they're moving in the right direction. Your country's moving in the wrong direction that people can't even afford to rent. They're living in their cars. Nobody that I meet in the countries I go around the world is talking about living in their car. They're talking about opportunities. They're optimistic. That's the story you should take away.
All right. So my last question is exit taxes, because this is something that kind of plagues the American that is looking at maybe doing something, whether it's getting into another company with a residential program, or actually becoming a citizen and getting another passport. U.S. exit taxes right now, the price of renouncing your citizenship. Really, what it boils down to, from what I'm understanding within our research here, is if your net worth exceeds 2 mil when you renounce, you'd basically considered and covered an expatriate. But if you're going above that, you're continuing to get hit here from the IRS. So it's even into the sense of unrealized capital gains. What have been some of the strategies that you've done for Americans that have been able to say, hey, okay, I'm going to go and look at retiring in Mexico. How do I go about that? And my net worth is 20 million or 10 million or whatever it might be.
Well, none of this is tax advice. There's a couple things. First of all, I mean, just getting a residence permit or just getting a second citizenship doesn't trigger an exit tax.
Yeah.
Americans who choose to give up U.S. citizenship to exit the U.S. tax system, they basically move forward. Hey, you would have had to sell this stuff eventually, so just
Right.
consider that you've sold it now as you're leaving, and we'll get our last pound of flesh from you. And so you're moving that up. I mean, one thing is just when do you go in and do the appointment? You can defer the actual payment more, as much as 12, 15 months, depending on when you go in and do the appointment. We had a guy with like $500 million. And I said, why did none of your lawyers tell you to do it, on this date rather than 2 weeks earlier? Because you'll have more time. Sometimes you don't want more time, but sometimes you do. But anyway, this is not just a U.S. issue. People who leave certain other countries, you keep your citizenship in Australia or Canada, for example. But it's like, well, okay, you're leaving our tax system. The Netherlands is kind of ramping this up right now. So a lot of countries have an exit tax when you leave your tax resident status. The difference is to fully do that as an American, you have to give up your citizenship. Yes,
Right.
there's the Puerto Rico. Yes, if you're running a business, there's the foreign earned income exclusion. But to fully just remove all the chains and shackles of the U.S., you have to give up citizenship. Whereas in other Western countries, you just have to comply with increasingly rigorous tax non-residence rules. You're gone a majority of the time. You cut your ties. You don't do this. You don't do that. So it's not just an American thing. And what I'll tell you is we had a couple people that hired us multiple times. It eventually became too expensive because they kept thinking they had time. And then when they finally wanted to pull the trigger, they couldn't afford to renounce, or there wasn't any benefit of renouncing.
Right.
Because, in one case, the guy, his company was valued at $200 million. Well, unless you have the liquidity to pay that, how do you renounce?
Yeah.
How do you do that? So, what I've told clients over the years, it's not about retiring to Mexico. You can do that and keep your citizenship and just stay in compliance with the tax laws. And there's ways you can reduce. You can reduce in many cases. Harder if you're in passive stuff like crypto. But what we've told people is, if you're in crypto, I've had a lot of guys, hey, I've got 800 grand today. I said, well, better get your second passport. And it hurts. And it hurts a lot more now because we used to get people second passports in the Caribbean. If you have no other way to get one, 6 months, $100,000 plus some fees. Now it's taken a little bit longer because the EU and the US bullied them. You've got to do an interview. They're a little slower. It might take 9 to 12 months. And now it costs 200 grand thanks to the bullying. So if you're sitting in $1 million in crypto, my advice might have to be, if you don't want to be in a situation where one day you've got 20 million and you're locked in like the guy I've talked about, you might have to just bite the bullet and take that 200 grand hit and just get it done as quickly as you can, because that's probably the quickest way to get a passport these days, faster than through your ancestry, faster than moving somewhere else. You might have to bite that bullet for the price of your future freedom. And I find that a lot of people, they struggle with that because well, that's $200,000 in my crypto. It's well, if the crypto is going to 20x, then your tax bill is going to 20x and you're going to be stuck. But if you find a way to get out now, you're at $1 million now, and when it gets to 1.7, you start making the moves, you could potentially pay close to nothing if you're an American, versus maybe you have to pay, who knows what the rate is in the future. Maybe Trump lowers it, but then the next guy comes in and raises it. So I think that, you got to bite the bullet sometimes. I have.
All right. Listen, Andrew, it's been great having you on the show. If you guys want to learn a little bit more about what he's doing, just go over to nomadcapitalist.com. Always fun to kind of get different perspectives on what's happening around the world. So thanks again for stopping in. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet. All right, you guys are maybe tuned in on the podcast side of things. Make sure and jump in over on the YouTube channel. You can, of course, subscribe to the channel and like a few videos if you're really trying to explore what's happening in the crypto markets, Web3, gaming, all that kind of stuff we cover here. And of course, if you're not in our Diamond Circle, that is our private member group. Gets additional content, all sorts of perks and benefits. So make sure and join that. Just use the link down below. And of course, out there on X, @Paul Barron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechPath.